In 2025, China's most important passenger jet hit a problem that had nothing to do with wings, pilots, or demand. The C919 could fly. Chinese airlines wanted it. COMAC was preparing to scale it, but the engine still passed through the West. And for a short moment, that exposed the weakness Boeing has to watch. When the United States temporarily suspended certain export licenses affecting technology sales to COMAC, it did not destroy China's airliner program, but it revealed something more uncomfortable. China had built a national aircraft it did not fully control, because the machine that made it fly still came from the same Western aerospace system China was trying to challenge. That matters because Boeing's real advantage is not only the 737, it is the ecosystem around it: engine suppliers, certification, maintenance, spare parts, and decades of airline trust. The C919 had entered that race while still relying on one of the deepest parts of that system. Now China is trying to remove it, not with a new airframe, not with a bigger factory, with the CJ1000A, a domestic engine that, on paper, sounds like a replacement part. But if it works, the C919 becomes something different, not instantly better than Boeing, harder to slow down. And in commercial aviation, that may be the first real threat, because Boeing can compete with another airplane. What it cannot easily ignore is a rival that no longer needs permission to keep building. The C919 looks like the part of the story China wanted the world to see. A Chinese-built passenger jet, Chinese airlines putting it into service, a direct challenger, at least on paper, to the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320. That is the headline version. But commercial aviation is not won by headlines. Airlines do not by symbolism. They by dispatch reliability, fuel economy, delivery certainty, maintenance support, and a machine that can fly every day without becoming a problem. And this is where the C919 becomes more complicated, because the aircraft may be built by COMAC, but the production version has relied on the LEAP-1C engine from CFM International, the joint venture between GE, Aerospace, and Safran. That sounds like a supplier detail. It is not. It is the pressure point under the entire program. An airliner without engines is not almost ready. It is stuck. You can have orders, factories, political backing, and airline demand. But if the engine supply slows, the aircraft program slows with it. That is why the C919's most important weakness was never painted on the tail or visible in the cabin. It was hanging under the wing. And for Boeing, this is where the story becomes more serious. Boeing's dominance does not come only from designing aircraft. It comes from the system behind them: suppliers, engines, certification experience, service networks, airline relationships, and decades of trust. China can build a visible aircraft faster than it can build that invisible system. The engine sits right at the center of it. So the C919 was not just trying to compete with Boeing. It was trying to compete while still depending on part of the same Western aerospace world that helped make Boeing so difficult to challenge. That is the contradiction. China had a jet that could fly, but not yet a jet it could fully scale on its own terms. And once that becomes clear, the CJ1000A stops looking like a side project. It starts looking like the escape route, because if China can replace that engine, the weak point moves. It is no longer sitting in a Western factory, a supplier contract, or an export license decision. It starts moving inside China's own industrial system. And for Boeing, that is a very different kind of problem. Then came the moment that made this weakness visible. In 2025, the United States temporarily suspended certain export licenses affecting technology sales to COMAC. The shipments were later allowed to resume, so this was not a permanent shutdown. But it did not need to be permanent. For COMAC, this was the uncomfortable signal. The aircraft could be certified, the airlines could be interested, the factories could be preparing to build more, and still, one decision outside China could touch the pace of the entire program. That is the kind of moment that changes how people inside an industry look at a project. Not because the C919 suddenly failed, because the weakness became measurable. The public story around the C919 was that China had built a national airliner to challenge Boeing and Airbus. It was supposed to show that China could reduce its dependence on foreign aircraft and take a larger role in commercial aviation. But the export license episode exposed the less comfortable version of the story. A production line can only move as fast as its most restricted part. And for the C919, that part was still connected to the West. If an engine shipment slows, delivery schedules become uncertain. If deliveries become uncertain, airlines cannot plan capacity with confidence. And if airlines cannot rely on the aircraft arriving on time, the C919 remains less a true Boeing challenger and more of a protected domestic program, still fighting its own supply chain. That is what made 2025 important. It showed that China's aviation program could be pressured without anyone touching the aircraft itself. You do not need to ground the fleet. You do not need to block every component. You only need to slow the part everything else depends on. That is where the CJ1000A becomes more than an engineering project. From China's perspective, the lesson was not simply that Western suppliers can be unreliable. That would be too easy. The deeper lesson was that dependence becomes a strategic risk once commercial aviation turns into a geopolitical contest. And Boeing does not need to be directly involved for this to matter to Boeing. Every delay to the C919 protects the existing order a little longer. Every bottleneck buys time for Boeing and Airbus. Every foreign dependency keeps COMAC from becoming the kind of competitor that can scale on its own terms. But if China replaces the engine, that leverage starts to weaken. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Not without risk. But the direction changes. The C919 stops being only a question of aircraft design and becomes a question of industrial control. Because whoever controls the engine controls the pace of the aircraft program. And China does not want that pace set in Washington, Paris, or Cincinnati. It wants it set in Shanghai. This is where the story can get exaggerated. When people hear China is building its own engine, the debate usually becomes, is it as good as the Western engines? Fair question, but too narrow. The CJ1000A is not a sudden announcement. A model appeared years before the C919 entered service. Prototypes were assembled and tested. Then reports in 2023 showed it moving into flight testing as a possible domestic alternative for the C919. That milestone path matters. A model proves ambition. A test run proves a machine can operate. A flight test proves it can survive real conditions. But none of that proves airline trust. And that is the hard part. A commercial jet engine has to produce thrust safely, efficiently, and repeatedly across thousands of flights, while airlines measure every delay, maintenance hour, and extra unit of fuel burned. On paper, the CJ1000A fits the mission. It is a high bypass turbofan for the same 150 to 180 seat narrow body market, where the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 dominate. But ambition is not certification, and it is not airline trust. The real challenge is hidden inside the parts passengers never see: hot section durability, fatigue-resistant materials, blade stability, fuel burn maintenance intervals, spare parts, trained technicians, and regulators willing to accept the evidence. That is much more than making an engine run in a test program. A prototype proves a milestone. An airline engine has to prove itself every day. Boeing's strength has always been more than the aircraft body. A Boeing jet sits inside a support system built over decades. Airlines know how to operate it. Lessors know how to value it. Maintenance providers know how to service it. And regulators understand the certification environment around it. That trust is slow to build and easy to damage. So no, the CJ1000A does not suddenly make the C919 equal to the 737 or A320 family. But it may not need to. If China's first goal is global dominance, the CJ1000A has a long road ahead. But if the first goal is to make the C919 harder to stop inside China, the standard changes. Then the issue is not whether it immediately beats the LEAP-1C. It is whether it gives China a second path when the first path runs through Western suppliers. A less efficient domestic engine could still be strategically valuable if it keeps production moving when foreign supply becomes uncertain. It gives COMAC leverage, reduces political risk, and lets China build experience faster inside its own market. Once a domestic engine enters serious use, every flight becomes data. Every maintenance cycle becomes experience. Every problem becomes something China can solve inside its own system. That is how aviation power compounds. Not through one dramatic reveal, through thousands of ordinary flights that prove the machine can be trusted. And if China reaches that point, the CJ1000A stops being just a replacement part. It becomes the beginning of a domestic engine ecosystem. That is what Boeing has to watch. Not because the CJ1000A is already better, but because China is trying to turn the hardest missing piece of its aviation industry into something it controls. This is a part that gets missed when the CJ1000A is treated like a simple engine comparison. If the question is only which engine is better today, Western engines still have the advantage. They have more operating history, stronger maintenance networks, deeper certification credibility, and decades of trust with airlines. China cannot announce a domestic engine and erase that gap, but that is not the only game being played. The CJ1000A does not need to beat the LEAP-1C on day one to matter. It needs to give COMAC an alternative and prove the C919 is not permanently trapped behind one foreign control bottleneck. That is a different measure of success. For an airline, a slightly weaker engine is a problem. For a country chasing industrial independence, it can still be a breakthrough. Commercial aviation is not only about performance. It is about control, engines, spare parts, certification, software, maintenance standards, repair networks, and technical support. For Boeing and Airbus, those layers are part of the moat. The CJ1000A is China's attempt to attack one of the deepest parts of it. If COMAC can offer a C919 with a Chinese-built engine, even first inside China, the aircraft becomes less exposed to Western pressure points. The supply chain becomes less vulnerable. The production plan depends less on foreign approvals. That is where Boeing has to be careful. The threat is not that the CJ1000A suddenly makes the C919 better than a 737. The threat is that it helps the C919 survive long enough to improve. Once China controls more of the system, it can fly the aircraft, gather data, fix problems, train technicians, and slowly build experience Western manufacturers already have. That is how a protected national program becomes a real industrial competitor. Not instantly, but persistently. Boeing is not just watching a new aircraft. It is watching a rival ecosystem being assembled piece by piece. That is why the CJ1000 matters before it becomes perfect. Because perfection is not the first milestone. Independence is. But independence on paper is not independence in service. And this is where China still has a lot to prove. The CJ1000A can matter strategically and still be far from transforming the market. A commercial engine does not become powerful because it appears in an air show, runs in a test cell, or flies on a prototype. Those are milestones, not the finish line. The real test starts when airlines have to live with it. Repeated takeoffs, hot days, maintenance checks, spare parts, fuel burn, regulator scrutiny, and thousands of cycles where the engine is expected to perform without becoming the problem. In commercial aviation, the best engine is often the one nobody talks about. That is the standard China has to reach. And it is brutal. Certification is only one barrier. Airlines need confidence. Maintenance teams need training. Spare part systems need depth. Lessors need to believe the aircraft will hold value if it uses a different engine from the Western option. Because an aircraft is not just something airlines fly. It is a financial asset. If banks, insurers, lessors, and regulators are unsure about the engine, that uncertainty follows the aircraft. So even if the CJ1000A works inside China, international acceptance will be much harder. That gives Boeing breathing room. The C919 still has to overcome production limits, certification outside China, support network depth, and airline trust. So the realistic threat is not sudden collapse. It is gradual erosion. China can use the CJ1000A to reduce vulnerability at home, gather operating experience, improve the engine, and slowly make the C919 less dependent on foreign suppliers. That path is slower, but harder to dismiss, because this is not a normal commercial product. A strategic engine program can keep receiving support even when progress is messy, because the goal is not only profit, the goal is leverage. That is the uncomfortable part for Boeing. The CJ1000A does not have to conquer the world immediately. It only has to keep the C919 moving long enough for China to learn, improve, and reduce the power of foreign bottlenecks. Boeing can compete with another airplane. What is hard to compete with is a state-backed system that keeps absorbing mistakes until the gap gets smaller. So the CJ1000A does not mean Boeing is suddenly losing the market. Not even close. This engine still has to prove itself in service, at scale, under real airline pressure. But that is not what makes it dangerous. What matters is what it can remove. If China no longer needs Western engines to keep the C919 moving, one of COMAC's biggest limits starts to weaken. The bottleneck moves from foreign suppliers into China's own system. And once that happens, Boeing is not just facing another aircraft. It is facing a competitor that can keep flying, keep failing, keep fixing, and keep improving with less outside control. That is where the story points next. Not to whether the CJ1000A beats Western engines today, but to what happens after China has flown it for thousands of cycles, trained the technicians, absorbed the failures, and no longer needs permission to keep building. Because the moment that becomes true, Boeing's problem is no longer the C919 we see now. It is the one China is learning how to build next.